The lonely woman told the cowboy, "Tonight, you'll stay by my side." The lonely woman told the cowboy, "Tonight, you'll stay by my side." Evening descended upon the harsh land of Colorado. Sable Creek, little more than a speck on the vast prairie, was shrouded in a red haze of dust that coated every rooftop, every pane of glass, and even the weary breaths of miners just emerging from the shafts. From the western canyon, the wind carried the screech of a rusted saloon sign, making the town feel even more desolate. 200 souls lived here, yet in this moment, all seemed hushed by the shadow of grief that had just fallen upon one family. Ruth Carver stood on the worn wooden steps of her father's general store. Her mourning dress, gray-black and dust-stained, snapped in the evening wind. Her eyes, swollen from days of tears, still held a steady light. One hand gripped the railing so tightly, her knuckles shone pale. 3 days ago, her father, the only man who had protected this land, was buried beneath the northern hill. She had barely begun to grieve when a new territorial law was announced: no unmarried woman could retain rights to mineral land. And Sable Creek, where her father had struck silver 5 years before, had suddenly become prey for the powerful. Ruth knew this was no accident of law. It was the work of Ezekiel Northam, the wealthiest, most ruthless man in the region. He had already squeezed the miners dry, poisoned the creek with chemicals, and now schemed to seize her family's last claim. By sundown, when he filed his petition at the land office, her inheritance would be gone unless she had a husband. The wind rose, carrying the echo of distant hoofbeats. Ruth lifted her head. Through the veil of dust, a lone rider appeared. His dark brown duster whipped behind him as the horse moved at a slow, steady pace. Each strike of its hooves echoed in Ruth's chest, quickening her heart. He was no miner. His posture was unyielding. His gaze sharp, sweeping the street with practiced caution. The few townsfolk on Main Street fell silent, watching. Men muttered under their breath. Women clutched children close in doorways. Sable Creek had seen many drifters, but this cowboy carried himself differently. There was a gravity about him. The weight of battle survived, and miles endured, and the cold alertness of a man who had lived too close to death. Rafe Harland. His name would be remembered long after this night reined in his horse before the saloon. He pulled off his gloves, calloused fingers, brushing the worn grip of the revolver at his hip, a reflex as natural as breathing. He was a man of few words, his gray eyes more observant than revealing. All he wanted was a drink, a brief rest, and the open trail before nightfall. He did not yet know that fate had other plans. Ruth's heart leapt with a wild, dangerous thought, one that terrified her as much as it emboldened her. If she did not wed before sundown, she would lose everything. No retreat. No time. Her heart hammered the command: seize this chance, even if it was madness. Gathering her skirts, she stepped down from the porch, crossing the dust-choked street. Each strike of her boots on the hard ground rang out in the silence, pulling every eye toward her. Miners paused mid-sentence. Mothers held their breath. The wind whipped her dress about her frame, casting her as a figure defying destiny itself. Rafe had just dismounted, loosening the reins, when the small black-clad figure halted before him. He frowned, about to speak, when she raised her chin. Eyes bright against the morning veil, her voice rang out clear and unflinching, freezing the entire street. "You're sleeping with me tonight." A stunned silence fell. Somewhere inside the saloon, a spoon clattered to the floor. A child gaped until his mother quickly covered his mouth. Rafe stiffened his hand, twitching toward his gun by instinct. But then his eyes met hers, not mocking, not deceitful, but fierce with despair and a burning will. The town held its breath. From across the street, Ezekiel Northam emerged from the brick building, gold-rimmed spectacles glinting. His smile was cruel, savoring the spectacle like theater staged for his amusement. Rafe tilted his head, mouth curving in the faintest smirk. His voice, low and rough with a southern drawl, broke the silence, "Ma'am. I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Ruth stepped closer. Her words a whisper meant only for him. "By sundown, I lose everything. Be my husband for a day. I'll pay you well." In that instant, her boldness stood in sharp contrast to his guarded silence. A woman willing to gamble all for her legacy. A man unwillingly drawn into her storm. Two strangers colliding in the dust-choked heart of Sable Creek. And from that moment forward, nothing in the town would ever be the same. Part 1. A Marriage Before Sunset. The western mountains were already cloaked in twilight, their shadows stretching long across the rickety wooden houses of Sable Creek. On the main street, the crowd had not dispersed. Ruth Carver's bold declaration still echoed in every ear. Some sneered, dismissing it as the madness of a desperate widow. Others whispered, suspecting a hidden plot. But most simply watched in silence, for they all knew Ruth Carver was standing at the most perilous crossroads of her life. Rafe Harland, the drifting cowboy, had intended only to rest in town for a few hours. Instead, he now found himself drawn into a strange storm. His gray eyes swept over Ruth, then toward the crowd. He caught the gaze of Ezekiel Northam, the wealthiest and most powerful man in the territory, standing with arms crossed on the steps of the red brick land office. A flicker of amusement lit Northam's eyes, as though he were waiting for a farce to play out. Ruth inhaled deeply, her trembling hand clutching Rafe's sleeve. Though her whole body shook, her voice carried firm enough for all to hear. "Before the sun sets, we must reach the courthouse. If not, I lose everything." Rafe's brows furrowed. "And why me, Mrs. Carver?" His voice was steady, though laced with suspicion. Her reply was swift, sharp. "Because you're the only stranger here, the only man Northam hasn't bought." Rafe's frown deepened. He hated being pulled into other people's quarrels. Yet Ruth's eyes, frightened but unyielding, made him pause. At last, he gave a slight nod, like a gambler unwillingly placing his stake. The red brick building loomed at the town center, its faded wooden sign reading Town Hall and Land Office. Inside, dim oil lamps cast a wavering glow over stacks of papers and a massive ledger. The Justice of the Peace. A short man with a curling mustache sat behind the heavy desk. He looked distinctly uneasy as Ruth entered with the unfamiliar cowboy. The townsfolk pressed in, jostling outside the doorway, holding their breath. The air was thick, as if they were about to witness an execution rather than a marriage. Ruth stood tall, her voice trembling, but clear. "I, Ruth Carver, petition to be legally married to this man." The justice pushed his spectacles higher on his nose, eyeing Ruth and Rafe with doubt. "Miss Carver, this is a grave matter. Are you certain you hardly know this man?" "I'm certain," Ruth cut him off. slamming her palm onto the desk so firmly the ledger trembled. "We have no time." Rafe leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching everything. Doubt still lingered in him, yet something urged him not to walk away. His low, gravelly voice finally filled the room. "My name is Rafe Harland." "I agree." Gasps rippled outside the doorway. Some women clapped hands over their mouths. A few miners chuckled crudely. Yet no one left, for they all sensed this moment would be retold in the saloon for years to come. The justice opened the ledger, turning to a blank page. His pen quivered as he dipped it in ink, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing against him. Muttering under his breath, he said, "This is unprecedented in Sable Creek, a marriage at the stroke of law's deadline." He wrote Ruth's name, then paused. The husband's name, Rafe, stepped forward, his calloused fingers gripping the pen. His signature was short, unflinching Rafe Harland. Ruth's gaze clung to his hand as he wrote. Her heart pounded as though she had just staked her life on a stranger. With a trembling grip, she followed, yet her letters held steady Ruth Carver Harland. The justice pressed the seal with a resounding thump. "So be it. From this moment, you are husband and wife." Outside, the crowd erupted in noise. Some laughed harshly, others whispered venom, and a few eyes held quiet sympathy. Rafe turned toward Ruth. His expression was measured, part suspicion, part curiosity, and wholly cautious. He did not understand why he had let himself be bound to this. Ruth met his gaze, her chest tightening. She knew he did not yet trust her, but as long as he hadn't turned away, she still had hope. Softly for him alone, she whispered, "Thank you, even if only for a day." Rafe said nothing. He gave a brief nod, his gray eyes cold, yet searching as if weighing something far beyond a hasty contract. Outside, the sun sank lower, casting crimson light across the dusty street. From a distance, Northam watched through his gleaming spectacles, his mouth curling into a wolfish smile. To him, this marriage was no ending. It was merely the opening move of a greater game. Inside the cramped office, the contract was sealed. A desperate widow and a wandering cowboy were now husband and wife under the law. Beyond the door, the town clock struck its chime, echoing warning of the few hours left before nightfall. Ruth felt her shoulders ease, though unease lingered in her chest. Rafe, outwardly impassive, knew the truth. From the moment his pen touched the page, his fate was no longer his own. And so beneath the blood-red sky, the marriage before sunset in Sable Creek began an uneasy bond fraught with doubt, yet opening the path to turns no one could yet foresee. Part 2. The Shadow of Northam. Late evening. The glow of sunset had barely faded before darkness swallowed it whole, leaving only a faint red halo over the western mountains. Ruth and Rafe stepped out of the town office, walking beneath the stares and murmurs that trailed after them. The crowd dispersed slowly, but whispers slithered behind them like snakes in the dust. Bitter laughter followed from some doubtful whispers from others, and beneath it all lingered a silence more dangerous than words, the silence of a predator waiting to strike. Ruth clutched Rafe's hand, her small fingers trembling, but refusing to let go. To her, it was not just a gesture of protection, but a lifeline to keep her knees from buckling. Though her young widow's face was pale, her eyes burned with resolve. She knew Ezekiel Northam would not yield. A marriage certificate alone could not stop a man like him. By the time they reached the small cabin at the edge of town, darkness had already settled over the pines. Ruth had just lit a kerosene lamp when the sound of hooves broke through the night, heavy, deliberate, and many. Rafe strode to the porch, hand brushing the grip of his revolver, gray eyes scanning the dirt road with icy calm. First came the torches, then the riders. Ezekiel Northam led them mounted tall, flanked by two broad-shouldered deputies whose badges gleamed in the firelight. Behind them rode 4 or 5 more men, each armed pistols, rifles, and each face carved from stone. Northam halted at the gate of the cabin. Slowly, he dismounted, brushing dust from his black vest. The firelight glinted on his gold-rimmed spectacles. His smile was thin, dripping contempt, the smile of a man accustomed to owning every soul within this town. Well, well. His voice slid out smooth, with the practiced polish of a lawyer, though steel rang beneath it. A lonely widow, suddenly a lawful wife. Touching, truly touching. Ruth stood straight, though her breath came hard. Her fingers clamped Rafe so tightly the knuckles whitened. Rafe looked down at her trembling hand, but did not pull away. He let it remain, letting her know she was not alone in that moment. Northam strode forward, his silver-tipped cane striking the ground with a hollow thock. He stopped at the base of the porch, lifting his gaze to Ruth, as a wolf studies prey already caught. You think that paper of yours will save the Carver land? The law may be law. His words slowed deliberate. Then he glanced at Rafe, lips curling in a smirk. But law, cowboy, is nothing more than a tool, and tools belong to those with wealth and power. The deputies behind him chuckled. One spat into the dirt eyes, glinting with scorn at Ruth. Ruth drew a sharp breath, her voice hoarse but unbroken. You will not take my land, Northam. My father left it to me, and now it belongs to my husband and me. Her words rang stronger than she expected, though her heart pounded like a drum inside her chest. Rafe shifted his stance, edging forward as if to shield her. His gray eyes locked on Northam's steady and unblinking. Northam laughed a jagged sound cutting through the pines. Little girl, you don't understand. I've suffered the Carver's defiance long enough. Your father, stubborn old fool, spurned every offer I made, and now you dare to defy me as well. He turned to his men and gave the smallest nod. Their eyes lit with feral hunger like wolves unleashed. See to it that by morning when the land office opens, the name Carver is struck from the books. Ruth's breath caught. She understood Northam's command was no legal maneuver. It was an order to uproot her body and soul by whatever means necessary. A tense silence gripped the night. Torches hissed in the wind, casting cruel shadows across Northam's calculating face. Ruth's legs trembled, but her grip on Rafe tightened like a drowning soul clinging to a post in the flood. Rafe tilted his head, voice low and rough, yet clear. If you mean to harm this woman, you'll have to come through me first. Northam arched a brow, then gave a thin, mirthless smile. A drifter, taking up another's burden. How romantic. He turned back toward his horse, tossing one last dagger over his shoulder. Enjoy your wedding night, Ruth Carver. It may be your last in this cabin. The riders melted into the trees, torches dwindling, leaving only the stench of scorched pitch behind. Ruth let out a shuddering breath, her body sagging as though it might collapse. But still, her hand clung to Rafe's. In her tear-bright eyes, fear still burned, but beside it flickered a spark of defiance. Rafe looked down at those fragile fingers gripping his own. Without a word, he tightened his hold just slightly. A rare gesture, yet enough for Ruth to know she was no longer alone. Part 3. The House in Flames. Night fell swiftly, swallowing the western mountains and spilling down into Sable Creek. The sky glittered with stars, yet their fragile light could not banish the darkness pressing upon the small cabin at the forest's edge, the last home Ruth had ever known. Inside the kitchen, Ruth and Rafe sat in the wavering glow of a kerosene lamp. Shadows danced over humble belongings. Shelves hung with dried herbs, a rough-hewn table and chairs, and in the corner, the iron chest her father had left behind. Upon the table lay a crude map, its lines tracing a silver-veined lode rolled and hidden beneath a folded cloth. Pearl Fenwick, the town's schoolteacher, arrived breathless. The stern composure she usually carried was shaken, her hair unpinned, her eyes urgent. Clutched in her hands was a law book. "Northam won't wait until morning," she warned, her voice low but sharp. "I saw his men gathering near the pines. They're carrying torches. And oil." Rafe merely nodded, eyes glinting coldly. He seemed unsurprised. Rising, he checked the revolver at his hip and the Winchester propped by the door. His movements were swift, efficient, the practiced ritual of a man long accustomed to preparing for survival. Ruth sat motionless, her heart heavy as stone. She gazed around the cabin. Every crack in the wooden walls held a memory of her father. His laughter, his voice, the warm evenings when he spoke of the silver stream, all surged back at once. The thought of losing this house crushed her chest like an iron fist. Then came the sound outside, hoofbeats, shouts. Rafe doused the lamp and pulled Ruth back. Firelight spilled against the windows, torches surrounding the cabin. "Burn it," barked a deputy, his order sharp, merciless. In an instant, flames licked the porch. Black smoke poured in, the acrid stench of burning pine filling their lungs. Ruth clamped a hand over her mouth, tears streaming not from the smoke but from grief. The home her father had built, the last place that carried his memory, was being consumed before her eyes. Pearl seized her arm, trembling. "Quick, Ruth. The cellar your father once showed me." Rafe moved without hesitation, prying up a floorboard near the stove. A small trapdoor yawned open, damp earth rising from below. He lit a lantern, urging go. For a heartbeat, Ruth stood frozen, staring at the room, as flames climbed the herb rack glass jars, bursting with sharp cracks. The sight cut her heart like a blade. Tears blurred her vision. Yet within them, a hard light flared. Ruth whispered more to herself than to the others. "The house may burn, but the truth my father left behind will not." She descended into the cellar. Pearl followed. Rafe entered last, pulling the hatch closed. Darkness swallowed them, broken only by the lantern's dim flicker. The tunnel was narrow, its earthen walls damp and cold, the air rank with mold. Overhead, the roar of fire thundered, beams cracking as the roof gave way. Ruth clutched a small satchel close to her chest. The map and ore samples inside, the only treasure she had saved. Pearl gasped, voice shaking. "If they discover the tunnel." Rafe led the way, his shadow stretching against the dirt walls, tall and unyielding. His voice was steady, firm. "Stay close. This leads to the old mine. We'll make it through." Ruth's eyes fixed on his broad back as she tightened her grip on the satchel. pain mingled with resolve inside her. From the moment the cabin caught fire, she was no longer merely a grieving widow. That cruel blaze had also kindled a flame within her, the will to fight. Above, the cabin was engulfed. From a distance, Northam watched the inferno reflected in his gold-rimmed glasses. He smiled, thinly satisfied, like a man sweeping away an obstacle. By morning, he told his men this land will be nothing but ashes. He did not know that underground Ruth and her companions pressed forward through the dark, carrying proof that could shatter his empire. Nearly half a mile on the tunnel opened into a rocky hollow along the mountainside. They emerged beneath a sky ablaze with stars, the cold air sharp and clean. Behind them, the cabin burned bright, a funeral torch against the night. Ruth turned back. Her eyes were red wet with tears. Yet when Rafe's hand rested on her shoulder, she lifted her head high. "He can burn my house," she said, voice breaking, yet steady. "But he will never take the truth, and I will not let him destroy this land any further." Pearl looked at her friend and saw no trace of the timid widow, only the fire of defiance. Rafe gave a slight nod, respect flickering in his gaze. This woman, he thought, was no longer just defending her father's claim. She was standing guard over the very soul of Sable Creek. In the shadow of the pines, Ruth gripped Rafe's calloused hand. This time, it was not for comfort, but for declaration. She was no longer alone. Out of the fire of loss, a new resolve had been forged. Far away, the burning house blazed like a beacon. That night, Sable Creek crossed into a new chapter, a chapter where Northam's shadow loomed large, yet had unwittingly awakened a resistance fiercer than he ever imagined. Part 4. The Healing Hand. Morning draped the valley in a thin veil of mist, steeped with the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Ruth, Rafe, and Pearl had found shelter in the cabin of Seely, an old friend of Ruth's father, a healer, and a native who lived in harmony with the mountains. The cabin nestled beneath towering pines, its roof of dark oak shingles surrounded by a flourishing herb garden. The moment Ruth stepped inside, familiar scents enveloped her, the sharp tang of mugwort, the sweet calm of chamomile, and the resinous bite of pine. This place was not strange to her. As a child, her father had brought her here, teaching her to recognize healing plants under Seely's guidance. Seely greeted them with calm eyes. "Ruth Carver." He nodded. "The fire last night carried with it much sorrow. Yet I see you saved what matters more than walls of wood." His gaze flicked toward the leather satchel, clutched in Ruth's arms, the map of the silver vein. Ruth gave a faint nod of thanks, but her attention was torn away by the sound of labored breathing at the door. A group of miners stumbled in, carrying a man drenched in blood. His trouser leg was ripped open, the bone of his shin snapped and jutting grotesquely through flesh. His breaths came ragged face pale with agony. Jacob was trapped. When the mine collapsed, one miner blurted out rage thick in his voice. Dr. Morse refused to come. He said he was bound to Northam's work. Pearl went white hand flying to her mouth. But Ruth did not hesitate. Something deep within her surged forward, instinctive and commanding. "Lay him on that long table," she ordered, her voice firm, unshaken. The miners obeyed at once. Rafe leaned against the doorframe, eyes sharp, one hand resting on his revolver ready for danger. Yet slowly, his gaze shifted, drawn to Ruth's movements. She cut away the torn fabric, exposing the jagged break. Bone gleamed white against blood. Pearl recoiled, turning her face, but Ruth's voice rang steady. Pearl cleaned cloth's top shelf. The cupboard, Pearl scrambled to fetch them without question. Mugwort, pine resin, and whiskey, Ruth snapped. Celie was already at her side, silently placing each in her hands. In that moment, Ruth was no longer the trembling widow who had begged a stranger for marriage. She was a healer, steady-handed and sure. She cleaned the wound, doused it with liquor, and pressed the bone back into place with swift precision. The sickening crack of realignment tore a muffled scream from Jacob, his teeth clamped on a rag eyes rolling back. Ruth did not falter. Her hands held firm until the bone was set. Pearl, pale but resolute, followed her instructions, packing pine resin to stem the bleeding, grinding chamomile to soothe the swelling. Ruth bound the wound tight and spoke gently. "You'll need rest, but you'll walk again if we keep the infection away." Jacob seized her hand, tears streaking his rugged face. You saved me. Without you, I'd be his voice." Broke gratitude choking him. Across the room, firelight flickered over Rafe's face. He stood silent, gray eyes fixed on Ruth. He had once seen only a desperate woman flailing against fate. But now, before him stood another Ruth, entirely strong, decisive, unwavering. And something within him stirred. His gaze softened. Memories flickered. Battlefields, comrades, bleeding out lives lost for want of a healer's hand. And here, in this wild country, he saw a young widow face blood and death without flinching and wrestle life back from its grasp. Pearl, watching, whispered to Rafe, "Do you see now? This is Ruth Carver. Not a reckless widow, but a woman who fights for life with her own hands." Rafe did not answer, but the doubt in his eyes was gone. When Jacob was finally bandaged, the cabin settled into silence. Wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, carrying the scent of herbs. Ruth slumped into a chair, sweat dampening her brow, her hands still trembling faintly. Yet her brown eyes gleamed not with fear, but with resolve. Rafe stepped closer, his voice low, rough as gravel. "You've done better than any doctor I've ever seen." Ruth looked up, startled. From a man of few words, the compliment pierced deep, a sudden warmth blooming in her chest. Their eyes met his, steady hers, shining with exhaustion. Rafe looked away awkwardly, though his heart beat faster. Ruth, weary as she was, felt it too. Beside her own strength, the silent presence of this man kept loneliness at bay. That night, she sat by Jacob's bedside, watching over his fitful sleep. Pearl drifted off with her head resting on a book. Rafe sat outside on the porch, revolver close at hand, eyes scanning the dark woods. Yet his mind was elsewhere, haunted by the memory of Ruth's small but unflinching hands, her fierce eyes in the midst of blood and smoke and herbs. And in that quiet hour, Rafe Harland realized what he had not expected. His guarded heart, cold and shut for so long, had begun to stir. Part 5. Evidence in the shadows. The night dragged on heavy with tension. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying the bitter scent of ash from the cabin that had burned the evening before. Rafe kept his vigil with a rifle across his knees. Ruth sat unmoving by Jacob's bedside, while Pearl scratched notes into her worn law book, recording every detail of the injury. None of them slept. They all knew the fight with Northam had only just begun. Near midnight, the creak of wagon wheels broke the silence. A cart stopped before the cabin. The driver, gaunt and cautious, carried several sacks of flour to mask his errand. It was Ephraim Dulan, the grocer, his apron still dusted white, his face drawn with fear and resolve. Rafe stepped out, revolver ready. But when Ruth recognized him, she exhaled in relief. "Ephraim, why come here at this hour?" He glanced about nervously, lowering his voice. "I've brought this." From beneath the flour sacks, he pulled out a thick red leather ledger, its edges worn with age. His hand shook as he handed it to Ruth, as though it were a stick of dynamite. "Northam's accounts?" Ephraim whispered. "My wife works as a cleaner in his office. She copied it and smuggled it to me. Keeping it would have signed my death warrant. But in your hands." Ruth's heart pounded as she opened it. Pages crammed with numbers gleamed under the lamplight. Payments for special supplies lines, marked fees for officials, invoices for chemical shipments, Denver matching the days miners had fallen ill. Pearl scanned quickly, her stern face paling. "This is bribery clear as day. Look here." He doubled the freight charges, forcing shopkeepers into ruin so he could seize their stock. Ephraim swallowed hard. "For years I stayed silent, too afraid to fight him. But seeing you stand Ruth Carver, I cannot bow my head any longer." A soft knock at the door cut him off. Rafe stiffened, motioning for silence, hand on his gun. He opened the door a crack. A small woman slipped inside, wrapped in a gray cloak, a basket of laundry in her hands. Hidden beneath the cloth was a thick envelope. Mina Duarte, the quick-witted laundress of Mexican descent, set it down. "News from town," Mina said in a hurried whisper. "Northam just ordered a special shipment of chemicals. He told Dr. Morse to prepare a new experiment. One of my girls overheard while washing office linens. She revealed the invoice. Massive amounts of mercury compounds, destination marked clearly Northam's mine." Ruth gripped the table's edge, her voice tight with grief and fury. "He means to poison the creek again, force the people off their land." Mina's eyes flashed. "Not just that. Word is, a federal judge will pass through Sable Creek next week. If we gather enough proof, we can put it in his hands directly." Pearl spread the papers across the table, the red ledger at the center, invoices around it, Ephraim's testimony, and Ruth and Celie's records of illness. The humble cabin became a war room. Pearl adjusted her spectacles, voice resolute. "Each of these entries is evidence. Here, March 12th. Northam paid his patrol the very night a miner's house burned. Too precise to be chance." Ephraim added, "I sold them kerosene that day. These receipts prove it. I will testify." Mina's chin lifted proudly. "And I can bring at least 3 other maids who heard him boast about bribing officials." Ruth sat silently, eyes fixed on the 2 books before her, her father's journal and Northam's ledger. One, a record of hope. The other, a catalog of crimes, 2 sides of the same battle. Her voice was low, steady. "This is the key. With these, Northam cannot deny his guilt." Word spread quickly of Ephraim's defiance and Mina's discovery. Within days, miners arrived at Celie's cabin, each bearing their own scars of Northam's tyranny. An old man, beard trembling, laid down a debt note. "He forced me to pay triple the freight on coal. My boy died in a cave-in. I stayed silent, but no more." A young mother, clutching her child, eyes red with tears, whispered, "My little girl nearly died from the poisoned water. Without your medicine, she would have. We stand with you, Ruth Carver." Pearl recorded every testimony. Mina wove the details into a net of evidence. Ephraim brought provisions, braving the risk. Rafe watched in silence. Yet within him, something shifted. The reckless widow he had met was becoming the spark of a movement, turning despair into defiance, uniting the broken into a force. Across town, word of miners rallying to Ruth's side made Northam furious. In his office, he slammed his cane against the desk, shattering a glass of brandy. Fools, he roared at Dr. Morse. I burned her house, yet they hail her as a savior. Morse's voice quavered. But she has real skill. The miners trust her cures. While I silenced Northam snarled, pointing his silver cane. When the judge arrives, I will bury her under paper and ink. I have wealth. I have power. She has nothing but a rabble of half-trained miners. Do not forget that. But even he felt the slip. In the reflection of his gold-rimmed glasses, his own face flickered with doubt. That night, Ruth sat alone at the table, her hands resting on both books, her father's journal and Northam's ledger. Her heart swelled with grief and resolve. Father, she whispered, I've lost our home, but not our hope. And this time, I will not stand alone. Rafe stepped from the porch into the lamplight, laying a hand gently on her shoulder. No words were spoken. Yet in his gray eyes, Ruth saw recognition and something more. Outside, the wind rose thick with darkness. But within the cabin, the oil lamp burned bright. And in that fragile flame, the first true evidence against Northam had been set alight like a beacon in the shadows, heralding a dawn no longer ruled by fear. Part 6. The Child by the Poisoned Stream. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, a sudden commotion stirred the quiet around Seeley's cabin. From across the valley came the pounding of hooves and panicked voices. Rafe, sharpening his knife on the porch, rose instantly, hand falling to his revolver. Ruth and Pearl rushed to the doorway, just as a group of miners appeared, faces stricken with fear. One man carried a small boy wrapped in a tattered blanket. The child's skin was ashen, lips tinged blue breath, ragged and fading. Save him, Miss Carver, the father cried hoarsely. My son. He drank from the stream and collapsed. Ruth froze, her heart seizing. The boy could not have been more than 8, frail and unconscious. The symptoms were unmistakable mercury poisoning from the very chemicals Northam had dumped into the water. Lay him on the bed. Quickly, Ruth commanded, her voice sharp, unyielding. The miners obeyed. Pearl fumbled for her notebook, hands shaking. Seeley moved silently, gathering herbs, with a grim expression. Ruth knelt by the child, pressing her palm against his chest to find the faltering beat of his heart. A memory washed over her, her mother's cool hand against her own fevered body long ago, and the words she once spoke. The healer's hand must be stronger than fear. Drawing a steady breath, Ruth spoke with authority. Pearl recorded everything. Seeley charcoal powder and thistle milk. Rafe, hold his head. Don't let him bite his tongue. Rafe obeyed without hesitation, cradling the boy's head in his broad hands. His face was calm, though his jaw was tight. Never had he seen a woman give orders so clearly, yet in that moment he followed her as if it were the only course. Ruth spooned a slurry of charcoal and water into the child's mouth. He gagged, retching black fluid, but still clung to breath. Then came the bitter herbs, their pungent scent filling the cabin. Breathe, little one. Hold on, Ruth whispered, her hand massaging his chest, coaxing life back into him. The minutes stretched. The boy convulsed, then gasped. Ruth's heart stopped with him until color slowly returned to his lips, his breath easing, his eyes cracked open, wet with tears, searching for his father. The man broke down sobbing as he collapsed beside the bed. Lord above, he's alive. The cabin was packed, nearly a dozen miners pressed into the doorway, watching in silence. They had seen with their own eyes Dr. Morse had refused to lift a hand, yet Ruth Carver had saved a life with nothing but her courage and her hands. A whisper rose from the crowd, raw with awe. If that were my child, I'd bow before her. The murmur spread, swelling into a hushed chorus, then silence again. For they all understood this boy was living proof of Northam's crime. Word spread faster than fire. By nightfall, scores of miners and their families came to Seeley's cabin. They brought lanterns, bread potatoes, and the weight of stories long buried. One man shouted, fist raised, "Northam has taken too many lives. Even children are not safe." Another added, "If Ruth Carver dares to stand, then we cannot remain silent." Pearl recorded each testimony, eyes blazing. Ephraim produced yet another ledger showing the unfair transport fees. Mina gathered the maids' whispered confessions, this time speaking them aloud before all. By the fire's glow, Ruth stood before the people. Tears glimmered in her eyes, but her voice rang steady. "My house is burned. My father is gone. But we cannot allow another child to die for greed. This is no longer my fight alone. This is the fight of Sable Creek." The crowd was still for a breath, then erupted voices uniting. For the town. For Sable Creek. Rafe stood apart, silent gray eyes fixed on Ruth. He had seen mobs rise in wartime, but never had he witnessed a single woman transform grief into a collective force. As the night waned, Ruth stepped out to the porch, gazing toward the moonlit stream. Beautiful on its surface, yet poisoned at its heart, it was the very soul of the town tainted by Northam's hand. Her tears fell not only of sorrow, but of defiance. Rafe joined her, saying nothing. His calloused hand brushed against hers, steadying her trembling fingers. Ruth looked up and saw in his eyes, no doubt, only a fire of shared resolve, perhaps even more. In that moment, Ruth knew she was no longer alone. And Sable Creek, long paralyzed by fear, had begun to awaken. Part 7. Preparing for Justice. The school bell rang that morning. Once meant to summon children to lessons, it now called the whole town to gather. Pearl's small schoolhouse, with its weathered plank walls and scarred blackboard, had transformed into a war room. On the desks, instead of slates and primers, lay papers, ledgers, jars of water samples, and dozens of handwritten testimonies. Candlelight flickered against Pearl's determined face as she moved between piles of evidence, arranging them with the precision of a city lawyer. "We need order," she said, chalk screeching across the board. 1 proof of poisoned water, 2 Ephraim's accounting ledgers, 3 eyewitness testimony, Mina, the miners, the families, 4 Ruth's inheritance claim, 5 the forged records of Dr. Morse. The room was silent, save for the chalk's rasp. Everyone understood, unless their case was airtight, Northam would twist the law to his will when the federal judge arrived. While Pearl marshaled the evidence, Rafe organized the people. Standing by the window, he studied a rough map Ephraim had drawn. Northam won't sit idle. He knows we're gathering here. He may send his men disguised as territorial marshals to seize the papers. A miner muttered nervously, "We've no weapons, just picks and shovels." Rafe's gray eyes swept the room, his voice low, hard as iron. "That's enough. Post men in the loft. spread sand across the floor to stop fire. 2 watch patrols on the trail. If strangers approach, sound the warning with iron pipes. No one enters without proof. Heads nodded. A strange calm settled. Because when Rafe Harlan spoke, there was no bluster, no promises, only steel. At a desk by the window, Ruth sat with her father's journal open, Northam's red ledger beside it. Her hand trembled as she turned the pages, the weight of both books pressing down like 2 sides of destiny. Pearl approached softly. "Are you ready? Tomorrow the judge will be here." Ruth nodded faintly, but within her surged memories, her father's voice. Justice is not a gift. It is something you must claim. And now she was living that truth. When night fell, only Ruth and Rafe remained. Pearl had collapsed asleep at her desk. Ephraim and Mina had gone home. Candles guttered low shadows, drawing close until only 2 figures remained in the glow. Ruth still copied testimonies, her eyes weary. Rafe stepped close, hand settling on the ledger. "Enough. You need rest?" She lifted her gaze, meeting his steady eyes. For the first time, she saw not only caution there, but a gentleness of concern. "Have you ever lost someone?" she asked suddenly. Silence stretched. The candlelight etched lines of war and weariness into his face. At last he spoke quietly. "In the war, I lost my whole unit. Men I called brothers. Since then, I walk alone." Ruth shivered. His words mirrored her own wounds. Her father gone, her home destroyed. She too had thought she was condemned to solitude. "Maybe," she whispered, voice trembling, 2 souls, marked by loss, can find each other. For a moment neither spoke. No promises, no clumsy gestures, only the quiet recognition that they were no longer alone. Outside, the wind moaned through the shutters, carrying the scent of dust and coal. Inside, the candle burned low, its glow binding their shadows together, their hands brushing over the papers. In that stillness, Ruth and Rafe shared something deeper than words, the foundation of a bond unnamed but stronger than the hurried vows that had tied them. Tomorrow, justice would be tested. But tonight, in that small schoolhouse, they found the strength to face it. Part 8. The Federal Trial. That morning, the air in Sable Creek hung heavy, charged like the stillness before a storm. From every corner of town, miners, merchants, women, and children crowded toward the town hall, a weathered wooden building, its roof gone gray with age. Never before had it held such numbers. People packed the hall shoulder to shoulder. Others spilled onto the porch, all waiting for justice to be spoken. On the raised bench sat Federal Judge Hartford, silver-haired, his eyes sharp with integrity. Each word he spoke rang like a bell of iron. To his right, a clerk poised with pen. To his left, 2 federal marshals, stern and immovable men, unlike Northam's counterfeit deputies. Northam entered with measured steps, black vest, pressed gold-rimmed glasses gleaming. Behind him followed Dr. Morse and the false deputies who once carried his badges. Though his lips curved in a familiar smile, unease flickered in his narrow eyes. Across the aisle, Ruth walked in with Rafe, Pearl, Mina, Ephraim, and Seeley. The miners parted for them, their faces alight with hope. The trial commenced. Northam's lawyer rose smoothly. "Your Honor, this is nothing but fabrication." Ruth Carver, now Ruth Harlan, staged a marriage to a stranger to hold her claim. She practices unlawful medicine, endangering lives. This is a charade to defraud the law. The crowd erupted in protest, but Judge Hartford raised a hand and silence fell. "Call the first witness," he ordered, voice resonant. Pearl stepped forward, her spectacles flashing in the candlelight. She outlined the territorial statutes, pointing out the loopholes Northam had twisted. With steady conviction, she declared, "The law does not forbid a widow from remarrying. Once married, her inheritance remains valid." Northam smirked faintly, but Hartford gave a firm nod, recognizing her point. Next came Seeley, joined by Virgil Stowe, a former metallurgist. They presented jars of water, clear from the headstream, tainted gray from below Northam's smelter, murky silver from the town's wells. Virgil spoke plainly. "These samples show mercury, arsenic, lead. I know because I mixed them under Northam's orders. This was no accident, it was deliberate." Gasps rippled through the hall. Mothers clutched children, close fear and fury mingling in their eyes. Ephraim stepped forward with the red ledger his wife had smuggled out. His hands trembled, but his voice held steady. "I was silent for years, but no more. These are his accounts. Bribes, shipments of chemicals, every crime in ink." Pearl laid down Mina's invoices. Mina herself stood boldly recounting what the maids had overheard Northam boasting of bribes, silencing officials, laughing at the people he poisoned. Each testimony struck like a hammer blow, cracking the mask of his authority. Finally, the miner whose boy had been saved stepped forward, the child pale but alive in his arms. His voice broke as he spoke. "My son drank from the creek. Dr. Morse turned us away. Ruth Carver saved him. Without her, I'd be burying my child." The hall fell into hushed silence. All eyes turned to Ruth. When the judge called her name, she walked to the stand. Her steps were measured, her mourning dress still dusted with ash, but her posture straight, her gaze blazing beneath the shafts of light through the window. "Your Honor," Ruth began, her voice steady though thick with emotion, "I did not choose this path. I only wished to protect my father's land. But when Northam poisoned our children, when he burned my home, when he threatened this town, I understood. This is no longer mine alone to bear. I am no hero. I simply did what had to be done to preserve life." Her voice caught, then rose stronger. "If I am called a liar, then I ask you to look upon the evidence laid before you and into the eyes of those I have saved. Justice is not for sale to the highest bidder. Justice is the breath of that child. It is the water we drink each day. It is the belief that the strong cannot forever trample the weak." The hall erupted cheers, shouts, sobs. Judge Hartford struck his gavel for order, yet a stern smile touched his lips. Then Northam was called. He strode forward, bluster already fraying his voice, unsteady. This is forgery. These peasants have been deceived. Ruth Carver is a schemer, nothing more." But Hartford silenced him, raising a telegram from Boston Medical College. "They confirm no student named Jonathan Morse has ever been enrolled. Explain that, doctor." Morse blanched, stammering, speechless. The hall thundered with outrage. Northam tried to rally, but sweat gleamed on his brow. The once untouchable master of Sable Creek now wavered beneath the scorn of his own people. And in the chaos, Ruth stood tall, her eyes burning into him, not with fear, not with retreat, but with the fire of a leader. No longer a widow, clinging to survival, but a woman who had turned grief into strength. From the back, Rafe watched her respect rising like a tide, and something deeper unspoken stirring in his chest. For he knew Ruth Carver had not only saved a town, she had saved him from the emptiness of a wanderer's life. Part 9. The Fall of the Powerful. The wooden hall of the town office seemed to hold its breath, all eyes fixed on the high bench where Judge Hartford sat, his face stern as if carved from stone. He had heard it all: testimonies, evidence, tears, and broken voices. Now only the verdict remained. His voice rang out deep and commanding, each word like the strike of a hammer. After due consideration of the evidence and witness accounts, this federal court finds Ezekiel Northam guilty of multiple crimes: fraud, bribery, poisoning of public water, destruction of property, and unlawful seizure of land. A murmur surged through the crowd. Northam's face blanched, sweat beading beneath his collar. Furthermore, Hartford continued, Jonathan Morse, who falsely claimed the title of Dr. Forged credentials, willfully refused medical aid, and caused grievous harm and death among the populace, shall be taken into custody and tried in Denver's federal court. Morse collapsed to his knees, hands trembling, lips fumbling for words that would not come. The marshals stepped forward, boots thudding heavy on the floor. They seized Northam, twisting his arms behind him, snapping iron cuffs shut. He thrashed, voice breaking into a desperate howl. You cannot do this. I am the master of this town. Without me, you are nothing. But his cries drowned beneath the roar of the people. Years of silence and fear broke loose in a flood of cheers, sobs and shouts of triumph. Morse was dragged out, pale as a corpse. Northam stumbled, shackles clanking, his golden spectacles clattering to the floor and rolling across the planks. The man who had strutted like a king now shuffled like a convict, his pride broken under the weight of chains. When the doors of the town hall swung open, sunlight streamed in, striking across Ruth's face. Outside, the crowd had gathered in restless anticipation. At the sight of Northam in irons, their voices erupted. Justice, one man cried. The cry swelled into hundreds of voices rising together. Justice, justice, justice. Men embraced women. Wept hats flew into the air. Children were hoisted high so they could witness history. Those who once bowed under Northam's silver cane now stood tall, shouting as though to cleanse the years of fear from their lungs. Ruth stood at the steps, gazing out over them. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not of grief, but of release. In her heart, she whispered to her father, Father, at last we have won. Beside her, Rafe stood in silence. Yet this time, pride glimmered in his gray eyes. He leaned close, voice low, meant only for her, You've done it. The name Ruth Carver will be remembered not as a widow, but as something greater. She looked up, meeting his gaze. No words passed between them, but she knew from this moment the bond between them was no longer born of a desperate bargain. The townsfolk surged forward, surrounding Ruth. Once whispered about for her audacity, now she was embraced, hands grasping hers, voices pouring thanks. Mina clutched her tightly, whispering through tears. We no longer need to whisper in the shadows. Pearl stood, with her law book pressed to her chest, her eyes alight. Celie nodded slowly, aged eyes reflecting peace. Ephraim, voice breaking, murmured, I see now. All those bowed years were wasted. On the square, laughter and songs broke out, spontaneous and wild. Children danced around a bonfire, its flames a symbol of cleansing and renewal. Amid the revelry, Ruth folded her hands, face lifted toward the sky. In her mind, she heard again the reckless words she had once spoken. "You'll sleep with me tonight." Words that had shocked a town, but had become the spark that freed them all. The fog of fear that had hung over Sable Creek for years was gone, burned away by the light of justice. And in the heart of the square stood Ruth, not the fragile widow of yesterday, but the torchbearer of a new dawn. Part 10. From contract to home. Spring returned to the valley of Sable Creek. The snow melted, and the once poisoned stream ran clear again, sunlight striking its surface like bands of silver born from the earth. No more black smoke rose from Northam's smelter. No more horsemen rode to threaten. Instead came children's laughter in the open fields and the steady ring of hammers and saws building new homes. The town, once shut in fear, now blossomed with life. Ephraim and the merchants formed a transport guild, setting fair prices together. Mina led the Women's Society, teaching miners' children their letters. Pearl held night classes for grown men and women hands, eager to hold chalk eyes, shining with the wonder of reading their first words. Sally was appointed environmental steward, testing soil and water to ensure no one dared repeat the old crimes. The miners formed a cooperative, sharing the work and the wealth. People who once eyed each other with suspicion now sat at the same table, sharing bread, wine, and songs of freedom. Ruth rebuilt her cabin on its old foundation. More than a home, it became a great garden of healing rose, of chamomile, mint, and wormwood. The air around it filled with herbal fragrance, a symbol of life restored. From the porch hung a wooden sign carved with simple words: Carver and Harland, healing home. Rafe, once a wanderer, stayed. He built fences, repaired the barn, and organized the young men into a patrol to guard the town. No longer an outsider, he was now a protector of the community and of the family he had found. One morning, Ruth stepped onto the porch in her plain dress and saw him pause from his work, wiping sweat from his brow, a rare smile flickering. She realized then what began as a marriage of necessity had become something enduring, a home. On the anniversary of the trial, the town gathered again. This time, not for judgment, but for a wedding reborn. No frantic signatures, no desperate bargain, but vows spoken freely before friends, neighbors, and the justice they had claimed. The schoolhouse that once served as a war room was dressed in wildflowers and white cloth. The townsfolk wore their best. Children carried little flags and laughed as they ran. Judge Hartford returned not to condemn, but to bless. His gaze softened as he looked upon them. A year ago you married under duress. Today I witness your union in freedom. Ruth wore a white dress of homespun cloth, her eyes radiant. Rafe stood in a clean shirt, hair combed, that rare smile steady this time. When Hartford read the vows, their hands locked together, once clasped in desperation, now bound in love. "I do," Ruth whispered, and the room roared with cheers. Rafe met her eyes, speaking simply, his voice deep and sure. "So do I." Laughter mingled with tears. For the first time in years, the town wept only for joy. Music rose, guitars strummed, and the celebration carried long into the night. Ruth's smile after all the storms shone brighter than the firelight. And Rafe, once a stranger in the dust, was now her home. That night, they stood on their porch, watching the town glow with torches and song. Ruth whispered, "That day I only wanted to save my father's land. But now I know he left me more than earth. He left me courage to fight injustice and a heart to find love where I least expected." Rafe squeezed her hand, voice low and rough. "And you gave me what I thought I'd lost forever, a home." Together they faced the dawn golden light spilling across the valley. Sable Creek had not only survived, it had been reborn. The tale had begun with a reckless challenge. "You're sleeping with me tonight." Words that once scandalized a town that had pushed Ruth to the brink of ruin. Yet from that wild gamble came deliverance not only for her father's land, but for an entire community. Now, amid laughter, through tears, amid hands clasped in newfound faith, Ruth and Rafe were no longer strangers, bound by contract. They were husband and wife in truth, the light that led a town out of darkness. And so Sable Creek entered a new era where love and justice walked hand in hand. That morning, the town awoke in radiant sunlight. The music of hammers and saws, children's laughter, and the rush of clear water blended into a hymn of renewal. New homes rose, green orchards spread, and the silver stream flowed pure once more. In the square, merchants, bargain singers, strummed families gathered with heads unbowed. No whispers of fear, no shadow of Northam's tyranny. Only a free people learning to stand together. At the town's edge, Ruth and Rafe stood side by side, eyes fixed on the silver mountains where it had all begun. She in her simple dress, hair tied neat, face alight. He in his dusty coat and wide-brimmed hat, gray eyes steady beneath the faintest smile tugging at his lips. Ruth's voice trembled with memory. "That day, I stood in the dusty street, desperate and alone. And I spoke words I never thought I'd say. You're sleeping with me tonight." Her smile quivered, eyes shining one reckless sentence, one throw of fate. And from it, everything changed. Rafe tilted his head, gaze on the silver ridges. Sometimes the destiny of a whole town turns on a single moment. One act of courage to defy fear. They stood in silence, the truth hanging between them. Ruth realized then those words had not only saved her land, they had saved her heart. And Rafe, once a lonely drifter, had found his home beside the woman who dared the storm. The West would always be harsh dust, and wind laws bent by money death lurking in the shadows. Yet Ruth and Rafe had proven love and kindness were the only shelter, the only fire strong enough to keep the cold at bay. Pearl taught Mina led, Ephraim traded, Seeley guarded the land. Each had a place in the reborn town. Yet all remembered the spark of change was a young widow who had dared fate itself. Ruth turned her small hand, tightening in Rafe's rough one. He closed his grip around hers, firm, eternal. No longer a bargain, no longer a contract, but a vow unspoken, sealed in fire, tears, and love. The wind blew from the silver peaks, carrying the scent of pine and the murmur of the creek. Sunlight poured over the town, warm and golden, a benediction on a new age. And the storyteller's voice closed the tale, a bold challenge in the dusty street. "You're sleeping with me tonight." Changed the fate not only of Ruth and Rafe, but of Sable Creek itself. From the shadows of greed, they built the light of love and justice. And in the Wild West, where law bends and death waits, only courage, love, and kindness endure as the truest shelter of all.